invitation as we speak. Having said that, it is a great honor today to be hosting Daniel Yergin, who will be talking to us about his views on how energy geopolitics work and how does that translate into Mexico. For those of you that do not know Daniel Yergin, not only does he work as a vice president within IHS, but he's also one of the most renowned energy writers in the world. Daniel Yergin has written he has written a Pulitzer-winning book, and for those of you that have read him, you will agree with him that it is not only the story of energy what you read in his book, but it's also the story about people and how people's relentless drive to innovate is what brings us today in the energy world. Having said that, Daniel Yergin, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And if you don't mind, I'll start. We're going to have this session as a Q&A session. So I'll start with the first question very briefly or very direct. Is the oil and gas industry, with all of the disruptions we've had over the last year, still required for the
Right.
future? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Merlin, and thank you for the opportunity really to join all of you at this important conference at a very important time. So very pleased to be part of it. And I should just add, you mentioned IHS Markit. I have colleagues, of course, who are there in Mexico, and we've been committed for many years to working with the Mexican industry. Many of you know my colleague Carlos Pascual and my other colleagues. So I was very pleased when you invited me to join your conference today. So you start with Merlin, that's a really big question. And of course, it's of interest to every single person at this conference. I think the answer is that first, it was a mistake to generalize what the future would be like as when we were in COVID-19, when the shutdown in the world economy. And we're seeing it now that last year, the global economy went down 3.5%. This year, we estimate it'll grow by at least 5.3%. So by the second quarter, we'll have a higher peak in GDP, and that's going to translate into oil demand. That translates into natural gas demand. Not everything will come back evenly. Jet fuel will be slower in terms of recovery than the other sectors. There's a question about the future of business travel when you can travel by Zoom, by electrons. But that said, the oil and gas industry is going to be a part of the global economy for a long time. In the new map up there, after a lot of work and a lot of work with colleagues, think that oil demand will continue to increase worldwide till about 2030 and then begin to slope down. Natural gas is going to continue to grow, but the energy mix with the focus on climate will become more mixed, and there's going to be an increasingly big emphasis on carbon capture as part of the picture. So, people don't think about this. They don't realize that 20% of electric cars are made out of plastic, just to give one example, or that the vaccines that people are taking would not be possible without petroleum products. So the long answer to a very big question is the oil and gas industry is going to be a very big part of the global economy for decades to come, I think.
Beautiful. Thank you. And the national convention that we have today, it revolves around energy security. And on your book, on the new map, you talk about how this concept of energy has been evolving. And I wanted to ask if you can give us a picture of what energy security means to you and how does this translate? Because you also talk about the North American energy integration. So I would like to
Yeah.
ask about how does energy security apply to Mexico in this North American context?
Right. Well, energy security means having resilience in the system. It means not being vulnerable to political disruptions or other kind of disruptions, and able to maintain the steady flow of energy that all of our societies and our economies depend upon. It takes on particular meaning in a North American context. In involving Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I remember some years ago, one of the people who was running to be president of the United States sent his assistant to me and who said to me that this particular candidate was talking about a uh, North American energy security and system. And then he said that, but his boss, the politician, said, by the way, I have no idea what I mean. Could you go talk to some people and figure it out? Well, I think we now know what that means. It means the integration of the three countries of North America in terms of energy supplies, energy flows, energy investment that's beneficial to all three economies and that promotes economic efficiency and basically supports economic growth and higher standards of living. And we've certainly seen that happen. And the shale revolution, of course, in the United States has been a very important element in that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And by the way, I would like to remind everybody who's watching this through our platform, feel free to write your questions on the Q&A chat, and we'll be taking them as we go along. Now, as we continue, I would like to ask, there's one big focus within IHS Market is this study about global supply chains. And global supply chains, they have been disrupted with COVID-19. There's no question about that. Now, the question is, how does that translate to Mexico? And what does that mean? I mean, we being part of this global supply chain, how does that translate into our future here in Mexico? Thank you.
Well, I think that it's beneficial to Mexico. Uh, Over the last 30 years, the world economy has really developed in a way that it depends upon the 5,400 container ships that cross the ocean carrying 20,000 containers at any given time. And it goes smoothly sometimes, but it's disrupted. It's been disrupted before. It's the most disruption it's ever had now, and COVID has something to do with it. The delays for unloading ships in Los Angeles is 15 days now. Uh, uh, Prices are going up because of that. People can't get supplies. So these are the Asia to the United States. 42% of the container ships that arrive, of the container traffic that goes to the United States comes from Asia. Well, ever since COVID, when it was discovered that how dependent the United States is on medical supplies and medical equipment from China, there's been a focus that has only grown stronger about redesigning supply chains, making them shorter, making them geographically tighter. And for Mexico, this is a major opportunity because companies will want to rebalance their supply chains and move to Mexico rather than depend upon ocean shipment. And so that's a big benefit to Mexico. But of course, as people are doing that, they'll be looking for two things. One, stability in regulation and contract. And the other thing, which goes to the heart of this conference, is reliable and reasonably priced and secure energy supplies. So for Mexico to continue to build its role in the global economy and be part of the North American economy, the development of the energy supplies that people can count on will be a very important ingredient and one aspect of the redesign of supply chains that has really taken on huge urgency right now because of the recognition of how vulnerable economies are, are to it.
That's super interesting, Daniel. Here companies, normally when we talk about the Mexi, people just see us as the operators of oil and gas fields. But in reality, there's much more to it because the supply chain is fully integrated. So whatever the impact the industry has in the upstream, it also translates into impact further down the supply chain. And I would like to focus now on the oil and gas companies themselves. And once again, taking into context what has happened with COVID-19. And what is your perspective on what's going to drive competitiveness within those oil and gas companies for the future? Is it going to be the same thing that they were doing before, or are there new elements to integrate here?
Well, I think there are a couple of different elements. One, of course, is response to climate and what's called ESG, environment, uh, social, and government, the requirements of investors. And so companies are adjusting their policies to that. We had our CERA Week conference in Houston, and listening to the CEO speak, I was really struck that companies have business strategy, technology strategy, and now they have an ESG strategy. And we see companies moving in different directions. Some are moving more to be energy companies rather than oil companies. Others are focused on being oil companies. I think all of them are focused on developing carbon capture technologies and capabilities, very important for them. And I think the other thing is that companies are going to be more selective in their investment. Uh, the major companies cut their budgets by about 30% last year from the year before. And so they're going to look at investing where there's stability, reliability, as well as geological prospectivity. And so I think that will be very much in the mind. And so I think we're going to see countries competing for capital more than countries competing for capital more than companies competing for access to resources. So I think countries will be focused on being competitive, and we see, and this is quite interesting for Mexico. You see countries like Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi that said that we want to control our industry are now saying no, we want to bring in international investment. We want partnerships. We want the technology that comes with that. We want access to markets and so forth. And so that's changing. And so I think, but for both companies and countries, change is now at hand. And for countries, it'll be very important to be competitive because they'll be competing for more limited capital from companies.
I couldn't agree more with you. And you're right. I mean, we made a map last year about how Mexico compare itself with the different countries within America and specifically within Latin America. And it is obvious that different countries are competing for the access to capital. And I don't, are you hearing the same echo as I am hearing?
I'm not hearing an echo.
Oh,
It's
okay,
fine for me.
beautiful. Never mind then. But then you spoke about how countries like Saudi or with Abu Dhabi within the United Arab Emirates are competing. But in your view, is there opening up to foreign investment working out for them? I mean, we see the Aramco IPO, for instance, and we see what Abu Dhabi and ADNOC are doing. Is that working out for them?
Well, I think so. I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, Saudi Aramco did a small IPO in the national market. But at CERA Week, the chairman of Saudi Aramco was talking about doing a further sale of stock. But what Abu Dhabi has pursued it in a different way, rather than selling shares in this state company, ADNOC, they have looked for partners in the different segments of the value chain, and if partners in terms of drilling or partners in terms of pipelines and so forth, because they want to, bring in capital. It's more efficient for them to do that, and they want the skills and the perspectives that companies bring. I mean, one of the lessons from around the world, at least that I've seen as I've studied this industry, is different companies, different people see different things. And where one doesn't see opportunities, another does. And opportunities get created. So you want diversity. And I think that's the strategy of the companies. We've been very close and observers in both what Abu Dhabi is doing and in what Saudi Aramco is doing. Saudi Aramco now is talking about bringing investors into different segments. And so I think that's a message to the rest of the industry, to the rest of countries that you're going to have to be competitive, and the value of investors with different technologies and different perspectives.
Thank you very much. You spoke about ESG, and just to comment to the organizers of the event, we're getting messages about the quality of the audio, but it's not from your end. I'm hearing you perfectly, Dan. I think it's from the perspective of the people that are listening to this through their platforms. So if the organizers just could have a look into this, please. Anyway, going back to this,
And I will try and talk louder if that helps.
thank you. You spoke about the ESGs within the companies, no, and how they're now emphasizing on having a strategy that involves the environmental sustainable governance within the industry. Uh, and that takes us into climate change, no? And I would like to ask, within this energy transition in a post-COVID world that we have here, and also referencing to the North American context, you see this new Biden administration uh, pushing forward with climate change as part of the international strategy. How does that translate into what could happen here in Mexico, and how is the U.S. going to push forward this within the oil and gas industry, obviously?
It is a very big change from the Trump administration. It's even a change from the Obama administration, that the Biden uh, presidency wants to be at the forefront on climate. The president just had a climate summit, as you know, with 40 leaders from around the world, and going to produce some very aggressive targets for what's to be achieved by 2030. When we do our analysis of those targets, we think they're quite difficult to achieve, because not every car sold in the United States next year is going to be an electric car. Uh, but uh, but the direction is clear, and this is all aimed uh, at the Glasgow conference next November, which will be the successor to the Paris conference of 2015. Uh, and the idea is to make climate targets much stronger, and to focus on how to achieve them. I think the what we could call the what is pretty clear. This target now of net zero carbon by 2050. The how to get there, is really hard and really unclear. Again, at our CERAWeek conference a little over a month ago, we had Bill Gates, who just written a book on this, and he said it's really hard. It's not clear what the technologies are. Even John Kerry, who's the chief climate negotiator for the United States, has said we don't have the technologies to do this. So I think what's being put in place is a direction, and at least the Biden administration wants to spend a lot of money, very large sums of money, to promote uh, this movement towards net zero carbon. But of course, we have a United States, in case anybody didn't notice, we have a pretty divided country. So there's still political battles that will be fought over it. But there's no question that the U.S. is, under Biden, is in a totally different position on climate than it was under Donald Trump.
There's no doubt about that. We have some questions with from the people um, within our viewers, and I would like to reference one from Daniela Rodriguez. She says she's a big fan of your book, by the way.
Thank you, Daniela.
And you talked about the Biden's administration, because she was asking about that. But there's another question about the role of OPEC Plus in the future, and whether you think they're going to be a real cartel, or they're going to have any influence within the price of oil. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I have a chapter in the new map, chapter called The Plague, which talks about what happened a year ago, which if everybody will remember when oil prices went to negative, which it seemed to be unthinkable, but did happen. Um, and the price just collapsed because demand collapsed. And it started off with a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And then they quickly realized it's a really bad time to have a price war, a market share war when the demand was collapsing. And so out of that, driven in part by Donald Trump, uh, and I should stop and say the world oil market really is dominated by three countries today: the United States, world's largest producer, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Last year, the three of them cooperated. Now, two of them are cooperating, and that's OPEC plus. The basis of OPEC plus is the cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it's working. It pulled oil prices out of the collapse into the $30 to $40 range, and now it's pretty much managing the return of all those volumes that have been held off the market on a kind of month by month basis, adjusting to what's happening in terms of demand, what's happening in terms of the virus. So I wouldn't call it a cartel, but it is, I mean, so many countries belong to it, but it is an effort to sort of manage inventories and demand and keep prices from either going down or going up. But it does take month to month adjustment because, 2 weeks ago, no one really what happened in India, and yet India is for oil in the world, and now that country's immobilized with this terrible COVID. So every month there'll be adjustments, but OPEC Plus is it's not really an organization. Uh, it's a meeting of minds. Uh, I have to stop and think about the term, but it has kind of assumed a role that OPEC once played in the world market, and it's been a stabilization. And at the basis of it is this cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to come back to Mexico. And once again, within the sphere of energy security, during the previous panel, there was talk about developing unconventional resources within Mexico. So we would love to hear your take on what that means for energy security. And in short, is it better to develop unconventional resources, considering we could leverage from the lessons learned from the United States? Or now that we're talking about energy transition and all of that, is it better to leave those as stranded assets?
Well, I think, I can't speak specifically to the kind of the geology, productivity, and cost of unconventional of shale. Certainly, shale has been a revolution for the United States. I mean, what is it? 12, 13 years ago, the US imported 60% of its oil. Now it's doesn't on a net basis doesn't import any oil. It exports oil. Go to India, and oil and gas exports from the United States have become part of the relationship between the U.S. and India. But uh, I think from a country point of view, one should look at oil and gas as a economic asset for the country. How do you generate not only the jobs, the technological development, but revenues, obviously, for government, for private sector, for all the social needs of the country? What's the most efficient way to do that? And to go back to kind of where we were at the beginning, uh, this energy transition is going to unfold over a long time, and oil and gas is going to be part of it for a long time. So really part of the key focus is to be a low cost producer, to be a competitive producer, to have the technologies that put you at the forefront. I think that's the kind of strategy. But to kind of pause for a second on energy transitions, when I was researching the book, I sort of said to myself, well, when did energy transition actually start? And like all these things, you start researching. And I can report to all of you that we are now in the 312th year of the energy transition because it started in in January of 1709 in a English village when a metal worker figured out that coal was a better fuel to use for making iron than wood. But normally energy transitions have taken a long time, have taken like centuries to develop. What's now happening is trying to make an energy transition happen in 29 years. Now, some things are already happening. Wind and solar are competitive, but that's why I say the direction's clear, but actually making it happen in a time frame that's talked about, I don't think is realistic. And I think the growing recognition, oil and gas are going to be part of the energy picture uh, in 2050 as they are today. We do work on the IHS Automotive on what we call the future of mobility. And today there are about 1.4 billion cars in the world. There'll probably be 2 billion cars probably in the year 2050, and half of them will still run on gasoline. So you got to get the gasoline from someplace, and that means from oil. So that's why you're not going to change our whole society overnight, and the technologies aren't there. And technologies take time to develop.
Quite interesting. 312 years. Um, so we spoke about where we're headed in this energy transition and that oil will be required. Question: who will pay for this energy transition? Will it be taxpayers? Who's going to pay eventually for this?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's a question that right now we're going to see argued a lot about in the United States. Uh, I think we're seeing under the Biden administration a really big step up in planned spending, and that's going to be quite, uh, it's controversial. So there is a cost to this. Some people just think, oh, it just happens. And by the way, even if wind and solar, which have really become competitive and important parts of the increasingly important parts of electric generation, the wind and the sun may be free, but you need a lot of materials to make them, and you need plastics for wind towers, and you need a lot of mining of minerals to if we're going to have electric cars. So one of the phrases that is so famous that's used around the world, people talk about big oil. And I think, you're going to have to talk about big shovels. You're going to have to talk about a lot of mining that will be necessary as part of the energy transition. And then things that are mined will have to be moved from one continent to another on ships, or have to be moved by trains or moved by trucks. So it's the systems are a lot more complicated than some of the language that you sometimes hear.
Interesting. We're starting to have quite a number of questions here from our audience. So I'll start asking, and this is from Chris Linton. We appreciate your question, Chris. Um, and he's referencing to what happened to Texas just a few months back. And the question is, do you believe that this has unearthed a vulnerability in Mexico's energy design? Um,
Can
or
you ask the question again? I had a little trouble
Yes,
hearing you.
no problem. Do you think that this creates disruptions within the design that Mexico or other countries throughout the world could have? Or he says, what sort of advantages? Um, sorry, what can we learn from this event?
Well, first, of course, the event in Texas was terrible and not anticipated, as often happens when something like that happens. Um, it has added to the problems with the supply chain because the petrochemical companies had to shut down, which meant that there's a shortage of plastics, uh, which is added to the shortage of computer chips that is affecting car manufacturing, including in Mexico, and the shipping disruptions, although that will improve over the next month as these plants come back. Um, I think it actually speaks to the design of the market. because they had, as I understand the system, okay, you have cold weather, you need electricity for consumers, so let's cut off the electricity to industry. Well, industry included the wells that produce natural gas. So they shut the electricity to the wells that produce the natural gas. Therefore, you couldn't produce the natural gas to generate the electricity. So therefore, you had to cut back more. And so if they had had I think we'll see if they had had a proper thought through this kind of crisis, they would have had a more thoughtful way to respond, which would not have made it worse. But what they actually, the actions they took actually made it worse. Now, there'll be a lot of arguments uh, and a lot of lawsuits as a result of this. But I think to me, that's one of the uh, basic lessons is, to plan for the unexpected, to what happens, what do you do if that happens, and not make that kind of big mistake, which was so costly and unbelievable in a way in Texas, which and Houston, which sees itself as the energy capital of the world.
Absolutely. We have another question, and this is talking about natural gas, actually, coming from Rosanetti Barrios. She says, I love your position related to countries competing for investors. Thank you. I wonder what's your opinion related to natural gas as a transition fuel? How do you see the evolution of demand for
Yeah,
natural gas?
I think that's really um, it's funny. A couple of years ago, people wouldn't have been asking about it, but now, of course, uh, it's being debated in Europe. Uh, and of course, the opportunity in different parts of the world is for more natural gas. We work a lot with India. I'm on the uh, energy think tank for the Indian government. And India has a $70 billion project to create a natural gas network to bring natural gas into the country uh, and also to produce more with bringing in foreign investment, by the way, because they want to reduce pollution, increase efficiency, and enable people not to have to burn wood and waste for heat and for cooking. Um, Europe is kind of debating what's the role of gas. So we have a study we call the Sustainable Flame, where we're looking at what's the role that gas is going to play, and what will be the role of gas, what will be the role of hydrogen. Uh, but I think that we see demand for gas globally increasing longer term than for oil, and so gas is, is a fuel of the energy transition.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The next question, I think it relates to what you also wrote in your book, The New Energy Map, about resource nationalism. And you spoke about it through the Arab Spring and how that started playing out. There's a question from Gonzalo Monroy saying, how do you see nationalism in terms of energy sources playing out in the future? Are we going to have more movements like this or not?
Right. Well, do you mean movements like the Arab Spring or sort of more nationalistic movements?
Yes, nationalist,
Yeah.
populist sort of movements.
Well, I think it is seen as a characteristic of the time. Well, it's funny, uh, Merlin, because at the one hand, all these forces tying the world together become more evident. I mean, look at what Zoom does to boundaries and to people's ability to be connected around the world. I mean, we had at our CERWE conference, instead of 6,000 people in person, we had 20,000 people virtually there. On the other hand, clearly there's a kind of rise in protectionism, uh, uh, nationalism. Um, uh, I'll come back to a particular part of it that's extremely important. Um, but um, but I think that and it's clearly an issue. It's always a question in Mexico, as you all know, and as any observer knows. And so I think there's sometimes it's important to look at what's going to benefit a country the most. What is at the end of the day, as I said, it's about revenues for the government, for the private sector, economic growth. how you're going to achieve that. And I think the general direction in the energy industry is towards more connection and openness. As we said, investment, you could never imagine investment 10, 15 years ago in Saudi Arabia or in Abu Dhabi in the energy sector. But there is, at the same time, you have, you know, populist policies in many parts of the world, and it kind of swings back and forth as a pendulum. I think where this is most important, and in the number one geopolitical issue facing the world, is the relationship between China and the United States. And that's where that goes back to what we were talking about supply chains before, because it's also seen as a, call it a competitiveness or national security. That's why you're one reason you're going to see some of the supply chains shifted back to from Asia to North America, and in Mexico would be a beneficiary of it. But the issues between China and the United States, uh, despite cooperation or verbal cooperation on climate, are going to, I think, are going to get more difficult. And there's basically a technology race between the two countries. And you can see that one of the things in the Biden plan for infrastructure, it said we have to promote, uh, we want to win the electric vehicle market against China. So I think between China and the United States are putting a lot of issues in terms of competition between the two of them.
Very interesting. Thank you
Excuse me
very
for just a
much.
second. I have to just shut a door.
Yes. So in the meantime, while Daniel Yergin comes back, just a reminder to everybody to please write down your questions. We still have about 20 minutes left within this. So I'll be happy to take in a few more questions here. And from the questions that we received, there's one about how, and I'll just thank Rafael Alejandro Paquera, who's asking if the producer economies are modifying their strategies for lower or longer, and talking about energy prices. And first of all, I would like to split this into a twofold question. Do you believe that lower for longer is the right way to view oil prices in the future? And if so, should countries adapt?
Well, I think that, you know, that's a very good question. And, I can remember, some people remember in 2002, people said $20 a barrel was the right price. Then in 2008, they said $100. Well, actually, in 2013, they were saying $100 is the right price. So I think it's always changing. I think the truth is that oil prices are volatile and will be driven by things like GDP, by political events, by pandemics. We learn. So I think that the goal of a company has to be a low cost producer, which means that you're resilient whatever the prices will be. It's funny, not so long ago that person's pointing out, people were saying lower for longer. Now, we see prices, I mean, we're seeing them in the $60 to $75 range. Some people now are predicting 80, 90, $100, depending upon what happens to the world economy and because of the lower investment. So I think with oil prices, you always have to be expect to be surprised because it will be determined by GDP or other things that happen. But you can see that there has been a decline in investment. And if we have robust economic growth, if the world economy grows 5.3% or more, and demand comes back, then you could run through the surplus pretty quickly and start to, have tighter markets. Uh, at this point, we think demand will recover to the 2019 level by 2022. But then something happens like this COVID epidemic in India, and that, you know, we still, how long will that last? And have to change the outlook again. So I think lower for longer um, really was a view, very prevalent when oil prices collapsed a few years ago. I think this time, really, this was not a supply demand price collapse. This was one that was driven by shut down by governments and economies because of the COVID, and it will come back. Um, but I think if we if if we are on a good solid economic and India isn't knocked out, we don't see other countries really hurt by the virus, and we see China strong, U.S. strong, then we'll have a foundation under the oil price.
Thank you, Daniel. There's another question from the audience, and I'll give a little bit of context. You speak about supply chains, and primarily what I've inferred is, with the tension that might happen, the geopolitical tension between Asia, primarily Asia, and the U.S., Mexico could benefit from that, as you mentioned. But we also have integration of our supply chains within the Gulf side of Mexico and the U.S. and the Caribbean, for that matter. So I don't know if you have any take on that sort of integration. We have, and the question is from Luis Velasquez. If you see Mexico developing offshore units to the U.S., to Mexico, by offshore units, I mean not only topsides for shallow water, but FPSOs for deep water, and how can we leverage labor and all of those things that we have in the manufacturing as a high um, support to Mexico?
Well, I think that's one of the three very good examples of where both Mexico and the United States can benefit from energy integration. If I understand the question right, it's tying in the Mexican development of Mexico offshore into the US system, basically saving money, uh, moving supplies to markets more quickly. Uh, and as long as there's confidence on both sides and reliable, predictable, the regulation isn't going to change dramatically, uh, that makes a lot of sense. It's more efficient. A second example of the integration is that Mexico's heavy oil is what U.S. refineries were made for. So that heavy oil come to the U.S. refineries, and Mexico needs gasoline, and those refineries take that heavy oil and turn it into gasoline, again, beneficial for both countries. I think a third example is the export of U.S. natural gas to Mexico, used to generate, like this is conceptually using to generate electricity. That electricity goes into uh, industrial production, and that comes back in terms of goods being exported from Mexico to the United States, creating jobs. So those are, if we were talking before about energy integration, I think those are three very practical case studies of the benefits to both countries of a cooperative energy relationship.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Going back to energy transition, and this time within NOCs only, what is the role, in your perspective, that NOCs play in the energy transition?
I think the NOCs themselves are working to develop and figure out what their roles will be. Um, I mean, we've seen more differences between the IOCs, the international oil companies, in the past, but there's a lot more difference among NOCs than there are among IOCs. But if I look at Saudi Aramco, they have or ADNOC, they both have energy transition uh, uh, strategies where they're looking at hydrogen, uh, they're looking at carbon capture, they're looking at greater efficiency. But Petronas is very interesting. The Malaysian company, the CEO, I did a discussion with him at CERAWeek, and he is clearly also, Petronas is also looking at what about biofuels? Should we be in wind and solar? Um, but I think NOCs have to be careful about not to go into businesses where they don't have a comparative advantage. uh, it may not, it may make sense to use solar for, in the oil field for electricity, but you have to think more carefully about actually going into the fields where you have established companies. But if I look at Equipetrol, which Carlos Pascual knows very well, they're looking at their energy transition strategies around companies are looking at what do we do about emissions. So the NOCs, I think, are also, uh, asking the same questions, maybe more slowly, but sort of saying, what is the role for an NOC? I mean, how much do you focus on your central business, making it more efficient, capturing the carbon and so forth, finding new uses, and how much moving into other businesses? And I think that's where we'll see differences among the companies.
Thank you. Um, and remaining within this question, because NOCs, they also have the push within their public companies. So it is also the people through their Congress persons that are pushing forward for this energy transition. So how do you see future generations playing out a role in pushing for this drive within the energy industry? And not only through NOCs, but also through investors that also back private companies.
Yeah. Um, I think that those pressures are there on companies, and you can see the European companies have responded, have feel the pressures more intensely. And so, as I think you're saying, it comes from popular opinion, comes from politics, may come from the media too. And so, companies are, that's what go back to, are developing strategies uh, to respond to it. It's interesting now. I think there's some other sound coming in. Uh,
Yeah, just a second, Daniel. Para los organizadores, por favor, de sala uno, apagar el audio. Organizers, please, if you can shut down your. All right, sorry, Daniel.
it's
Hopefully,
okay. Uh, we're all learning how to live in the world of Zoom and
yeah.
when to mute and when not to mute. But if you look at, British BP now calls itself an integrated energy company. Total says it's Total Energies. So different companies are redefining themselves in different ways. Exxon Mobil has come up with $100 billion proposal to capture carbon in the Houston Ship Channel and capture it and inject it. So they're going about it in different ways. And I think that message is there, and companies are responding. And as we head towards Glasgow, as we said, the successor to Paris, I think the pressures will grow.
Okay, so remaining there, uh, carbon tax, talking about incentives, not only pressures. What's your view on carbon tax? And is this something Benigna Leis asks us from Rice University? What's your take on carbon tax, and will this help the energy transition?
Um, Taxes generally are not popular, and so sometimes you have to call it the carbon fee or some other name. Uh, but the advantage of a carbon tax, if it's properly designed so it doesn't hurt the economy, it doesn't hurt particularly lower income people, has the advantage is that it sends, as any price does, a message and then says, you find your solutions, you figure out what to do with that. Um, and we're going to hear discussions about could there be a global carbon tax? What should it be? Some of the major oil companies have endorsed a carbon tax because they see that as preferable to this regulation, that regulation, that regulation. It makes it, it's more, it brings predictability to the scene. So, I think it becomes more logical that we may see it. The problem is it a national carbon tax or is it a global carbon tax? And how do you negotiate a global carbon tax? It's one thing to get countries to agree let's keep the temperature from rising 1.5 degrees, let's have net zero carbon. But by the way, we're going to go back to our parliament or our Congress and agree with everybody else to put the same tax. I think that's probably a pretty tough thing to do.
I agree. There's a question about technology, and I'll just give a bit of reference for those of you that are still about to read Daniel Yergin's last book, the New Map. There's a section or a chapter about how there's different technologies out there and how you guys within your the work that is being conducted in IHS, you track different technologies that could be disruptive. So could you talk a little bit about this, Daniel, about which technologies do you think are going to be disruptive in the future? And the question specifically is about artificial intelligence, and will that play out along in the future?
Well, I guess we're still in the, on one hand, discussions about artificial intelligence have been around for decades, but on the other hand, it's really, uh, the last few years, you really start to see the power of it. And, I'm not, won't claim expertise on that at all, but it could make, huge efficiencies and just change the way society's organized. And artificial intelligence really is necessary if you're going to have autonomous vehicles, uh, which I write about in the book about autonomous vehicles, ride hailing, electric cars, those kind of changes that will be there. Um, there's still, I'd say we did a study for Bill Gates Foundation about 2 years ago now about what technologies are really that you could at least see in the horizon that would really make a difference. Uh, Obviously, one of them is carbon capture. A second is improvement in batteries would be very significant. The third thing that's really, was not taken seriously a few years ago, but become really serious, is hydrogen as a using it as a replacing natural gas for or with natural gas as for heating industrial processes and so forth. And it's amazing in Europe, they have so many initiatives and programs and talking about 25% of the European economy perhaps being run on hydrogen by 2050. Uh, it's still like many technologies, early days, uh, because obvious, but it's also interesting what industry uses and works with hydrogen today. Of course, that's the oil and gas industry. And so one does see a lot of interest around the world in energy companies for hydrogen is one of the ways uh, to be a player in the energy transition, uh, particularly concentrated in Europe because Europe wants to be the greenest continent. The greenest continent.
So talking about these new technologies, I would like to pivot. This question comes from Isaac. He's asking what sort of skill sets do young professionals or people within the industry will need to have to be able to incorporate into this wave of technology advancements. Is there something in particular that you could recommend?
Well, obviously, this has always been an industry which the rest of the world doesn't always recognize, but an industry that is a technology-driven industry, and it's an industry that's largely run by engineers and scientists. Um, I suppose it would be data science would be will be increasingly important uh, within the industries, and in addition to the kind of traditional technical skills in geology and engineering and so forth. I guess I would add that to the list of capabilities um, that will be required for the industry in the future. Going back to the artificial intelligence, machine learning, how do you make operations more efficient? And one of the things I think about conversations with CEOs of different companies around the world. You talk about, they're all surprised to discover the degree to which the industry could adapt to less hands-on, more managing things from a distance with fewer people, more automation, number of people on a platform, just the general digitalization of the industry is a which really got going after the 2014 price collapse, but has really this this crisis has really accelerated it, and a lot of discussion about what the nature of work will be after the crisis will around the world. You hear that question: where will people work? Uh, to what degree will they be in concentrated offices and groups, and what degree will things be automated? And of course, some activities you can't automate or people have to be there. But I think if we go back to COVID, one of the questions is just how the nature of work will change. And of course, that then raises the next question, which is cybersecurity in a world in which people are working remotely. So there are a lot of things we're going to find, and I see different companies come out with different plans for work after this pandemic is behind us.
Thank you very much. I have a question about natural gas. And we spoke about the energy context within North America and the energy integration. We start seeing natural gas as a commodity that is now being shipped worldwide. You see it as Qatar has proven to be shipping this to different amount of countries. You see that from Japan. Now, will this rise in LNG mean that within North America we're going to start seeing natural gas prices increase as uh, the whole world becomes more uh, connected?
Well, we saw LNG prices go up, was it last summer? Kind of, again, surprising, again, and yet another surprise to people in the natural gas industry. I forgot what it was. Was it problems in China or Japan that led, maybe it was in Japan? Um, I mean, natural gas has become a global commodity. And, again, a surprise. If we went back a little more than a decade, it was thought the US was going to be the largest importer of LNG. It's now the largest producer of LNG and be one of the 3 or 4 biggest exporters of LNG. So it's a global commodity market, much more integrated, prices much more connected. But at least in the United States, we have a lot of gas. Uh, we So that, just the volumes of gas that are available, I think, is the ceiling on price. So I think that whereas we had tight gas markets before, one reason beyond environmental and climate reasons that gas has taken so much market share from coal is just because of price. So I think, at least I think we see it, is that basically the U.S. As a gas producer, it's going to be very abundant, and the availability of gas, big new project coming from Qatar. The Russians are stepping up LNG, so there'll be a lot of gas, I think, in the market. So I don't see, you know, unless there's a specific disruption that happens somewhere that sends the prices up for a short period of time. I think it's a well-supplied global gas market.
Excellent. There's a question with regards to your book, and this question comes from Jose Luis Mercado. And he says, Mr. Jurgen, we thank you for sharing your experience, but he admits that he has not read any of your books, and he's asking where should he start?
Oh my goodness. Well, of course, the answer is all of them. But I think I would start with the new map because that's the most current one and it addresses the issues. I think then I would go to the prize, which is the Pulitzer Prize winning book, which is I'm told still in so many companies sort of the book you get when you start working to understand where the industry came from and how it developed. And then in between, I'd go to the quest. So that would be the order in which I would do it. Now, the secret of all my books, I shouldn't admit this, but they all have photographs and captions very carefully written. And the purpose of that is to enable you, if you don't a lot of time. You can look at the pictures and read the captions, and the headlines of the story will come out. But and I have to say, it's a lot of fun creating, making a book visual with photographs. But my advice would be to start with a new map because that's the world we are in today, and it's the map to where we're going tomorrow. So and
Beautiful.
that's the author's advice.
Well, we thank you very much. We appreciate your time. And I don't know if you want to give any concluding remarks. Otherwise, Daniel, it's
Well, I
pleasure.
guess I would say that the history of oil and gas, particularly in oil in Mexico, is a very long history. Uh, it's to be very beneficial to the country. And in this competitive world, they're going to be uh, stability, predictability, creating an environment that brings an investment in technology that ultimately brings revenues to the people, to the government, um, is a very worthy goal for Mexico, and it'd be very beneficial for its economy. Um, but in the world we're going to be having reliable rules and not changing the rules is really important for maintaining the investment and maintaining Mexico's position in the world. And that, and what we've seen so often is, the state company benefits from having other companies there in partnerships and technology in terms of efficiency. So um, I think when you're in terms of energy policy for Mexico as for other countries, it's really important to be forward looking because it's a competitive world and it's a changing world. So, Merlin, let me thank you and MXC and everybody. I very much appreciated the opportunity, and I say this on behalf of my colleagues as well. This opportunity to share some of our thinking with you all, and wish you all the best in the conference and for the year ahead. Thank you.
We thank you. Thank you very much. See you.
Bye bye.
Bye.